Political Strategy. Yeah, okay, just going to say continue. Yeah, it's an XRNI Political Strategy initiated meeting, and we'd been working on a manifesto, around a political manifesto for XR that was local to this region. And then we got very, very interested in the climate bill and wanting to really consider how could we as a small group of activists really have an influence where we might be needed. And that was in part triggered by the Green Party conference, where some people were raising that issue, including John Barry, who's one of our guests tonight, and also by the New Zealand speaker, whose name I can't remember. What was the name? Abel, maybe someone. And anyway, he had a very interesting perspective on the climate bill in New Zealand. And Laura was there as well, I know. Anyway, we got interested in how can we, as a small group of activists, really help leverage change in a way. Where are the weak points? Where are the points where we might make a difference? Also, what do we need to understand about this bill? So we've invited 3 speakers. One, our own activist, Cillian McGrattan, who's going to do a critique of the bill. Laura, Neal is going to give us a user-friendly introduction to the bill. And then John is going to give us an insight into maybe, well, an overview maybe and where you think we might make a difference as an activist movement. So you're all very welcome. We will have roughly 10 minutes per speaker, and then an opportunity for Q&A and discussion and exploration. So does that sound like we're all on the same, where we're meant to be? Okay, so I'd like to invite Laura then to begin and introduce the bill. So you're very welcome, Laura, and thanks.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Let me share my screen here. Hopefully this goes okay. And can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I'm Laura. I'm a solicitor lawyer with Friends of the Earth, and we are part of the Climate Coalition, NI, who drafted this bill. This bill, actually, I don't know if you've heard, but it was referred to as a Disney World bill by Edwin Poots this week, which is class because like Disney World is real and it's amazing. I've been there. It's a class and we all want to go there. We should all want to go there. It's the happiest place on earth. So like, who wouldn't want to be part of a bill that does that? So yeah, and that kind of makes me like a guide of Disney World, which is like possibly the coolest thing I've ever been associated with, legally speaking. But anyway, so before I get into the detail of what this bill will hopefully do in the event that it's passed, the context and the background to this is absolutely crucial. So as you know, New Decade, New Approach, a number of years ago, promised us climate change legislation. And for many years, it just wasn't delivered. There was a reticence on the part of the department to bring forward such legislation. And while other countries were not only passing this legislation, they were becoming comfortable with their own respective versions, and they were amending it to be even more ambitious, and we still didn't have any at all. And with the pressing climate emergency then, and a response from the department once again when it refused to comply with the motion asking it to bring forward climate legislation within 3 months, Climate Coalition decided we would do it ourselves and draft sort of grade A legislation for Northern Ireland, taking into account comparative legislation that's been passed elsewhere, and in particular devolved nations as well, and in the Republic as well. So put all that together, and we came up with this draft bill. I should say the original version was huge. It was really long. There was a meeting of like legal drafting specialists along with some academics who sort of specialized in comparative climate change legislation, and it was cut down to this version, which has these sort of main points, these main sort of table legs that hold it all together. So that said, this bill is the only show in town at the minute, but there is talk of a rival bill coming from DAERA. We have an idea that that is going to be substandard. On a general point, our bill, this bill, the private members bills, I'll refer to it as, talks about a net zero target, and we suspect that the rival bill that's coming along behind it, we don't even know what's going to happen if two bills discussing the same thing get to the floor of the Assembly. I think that's unprecedented. But the rival bill may talk about an 82% reduction in carbon emissions. So Northern Ireland will always be emitting more carbon than it is ameliorating, whereas ours is net zero. So that's a big disparity between the two from the get-go. So yeah, in terms of the bill that's currently before the Assembly Committee, these are the key points. Apologies to John, who's heard this before, and anybody that was at the Green Party conference, because it's the same slides. So the key points are that it declares a climate emergency, and that's important because it gives the bill its authority. This is what it is here to stop. This is what it is here to address. So it establishes that, and then establishes what we need to do to combat the climate emergency, and that is to establish a net zero, climate resilient, let me see my little speakers box, environmentally sustainable economy by 2045. And we chose that date because, as I said, we're behind the curve, Northern Ireland. We're about 5-6 years behind most of devolved administrations' climate change legislation. Scotland has amended theirs to reflect 2045, and generally and globally there is a growing trend for the climate legislation to be more ambitious. And we felt that 2045 reflected the fact that we're laid off the starting blocks and we've got a lot to do. So it's the overarching goal. It puts the pedal to the floor, and that's what we're aiming for. So that's the overriding objectives. That's what the whole purpose of the legislation is geared to do, to reach that goal. And the way it's designed to reach that goal is that it requires the creation of climate action plans. Now, these are prepared by the executive across all departments and will be ultimately approved by the Assembly after public consultation. It was crucial to this bill that it had, or any discussion about climate change and anything that we might have to do to battle climate change, comes from a very democratic and accountable position. So the fact that it is prepared by the executive and then open to public consultation and then ultimately approved by the Assembly is crucial in having the buy-in to do what we need to do to reach net zero by 2045. And then for sort of independent oversight over everything, another really, really crucial part of the bill, as I see it, is the role of a climate commissioner. It's established as a sort of independent watchdog, effectively, who will constantly scrutinise climate action plans as they're produced. Climate action plans are supposed to be produced every 5 years. First one's within 3 years, and then every 5 years after that, right up to 2045. And it's established within the bill sort of what those climate action plans entail and how they should be set out and how they should be framed. Within that, then the climate commissioner is entirely separate, and that office then scrutinises the progress of climate action plans, their content, and basically provides that independent oversight to say that either, yeah, we're on the money, this will work, or it won't work, and give reasons why. And so it's crucial in that way. Now, based on what has been in the media, I think it's quite important to say what this bill will do, hopefully, or what this bill is and what it really isn't, because there's been a lot of inference in the media that this bill will, for example, tank the agricultural industry, that it's going to cause the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs, and that's what this bill will do. There's absolutely nothing in this bill about agriculture. This bill requires a legislative conversation to happen about climate change, and that's what this bill does. It forces that conversation. The content of that conversation is up to the executive, the general public, all approved by the Assembly. So the agricultural industry will not be decimated unless every MLA in Stormont votes it so. So that's a really key part. There's no specific mention of agriculture in this bill. It applies to all sectors. It just sets the parameters for this conversation, requires it to be had. So just in a nutshell, What this bill will do is that it will formally recognise a climate emergency. As I said, it sets an overriding objective, and then it sets out a legislative requirement for the executive to produce climate action plans, as I discussed. It says what those should encompass. You can't just sort of rattle any old piece of crap off and say that it's a climate action plan. They have to include certain things like targets and budgets. They have to refer to specific greenhouse gas emissions. I think the Climate Change Act that applies to the UK of 2008 specifies 6 greenhouse gas emissions. We've gone for 7. There's a second one, and I can't remember what it's called, something trifluoride now. And it reflects the fact that that has now grown in prevalence in terms of a greenhouse gas, and a lot of climate change legislation has been there's been a drive to amend that to sort of reflect that 7th gas. So I think it's the one thing that we're actually ahead of the curve on within the legislation. It states that these targets must be sector specific, lawful, consider the impact on NI, the need for a just transition, and NI's unique position relative to the UK and the Republic. And those are crucial, those parts of the bill, in that you can't just make arbitrary decisions in relation to climate change. Everybody has to be on board and nobody can be left behind. And that is crucial for moving forward. We can't enforce our way out of this emergency. We have to be all in it, committed, and we all have to do it together. And it involves that sort of level of accountability and discussion, and that's what this bill forces. And as I said, finally, the very crucial part is that it has independent oversight in the form of a climate commissioner. And that's been reflected recently. I think Wales has come up with a minister for climate change, or ministry for climate change. So that idea that you need to have independent scrutiny about our ability to address the climate emergency is crucial, and it's not just specific to Northern Ireland. And I think that's an important thing in this legislation, is that certain individuals within the department would want you to think that this is radical, and it's certainly not. It is standard legislation that applies and has been used and replicated in various different forms across the globe, you know, so it's nothing too crazy. But one thing, or certain things that it will not do, is that it won't say what goes into climate action plans. That's for the executive. So it's not specific. There was a temptation when we were drafting the bill to get overly specific and start saying that, you know, biodiversity needs to be evidenced in certain ways. We need to bring in nature-based solutions. We need to be really prescriptive. We need to show the executive exactly what they need to do. But then that's not what this is about. This is about the executive, with public consultation and assembly approval, democratically deciding the way forward and deciding that for themselves. It's not going to work that the Climate Change Coalition or any other body tells the executive what to do. And that's essentially why the Climate Commissioner doesn't have enforcement powers as well, because they can correct and they can show and lead and show by example about what the best way forward should be, but it has to be a democratic, accountable process because there's so much at stake. Another thing I mentioned as well is that the bill doesn't single out specific sectors. It says that all sectors must get involved, but it doesn't say, you know, that agriculture in particular has to do more, or that it's all balanced. It says that it has to apply to everybody, all sectors, so that no one gets left behind. And then once again, the Climate Commissioner is not an enforcement body, and it can't take the place of elected representatives. So it can't change a climate action plan, for instance. It can't just say that's not right, that's not going to work. I mean, it would be great if it could, but it undermines the principle of the bill, in that changes are made by democracy and they're accountable, and that's essentially it. So the Climate Commissioner itself acts like a guide. It's our barometer, so we know what we're doing is right. But its recommendations have to be implemented by the executive and approved by the assembly. It's the current that runs through this whole bill, is accountability and democracy. And that's pretty much me. Here's a class diagram that I did myself about what this bill does. I mean, in a nutshell, this diagram represents what this bill does. How we populate climate action plans is a very different matter altogether. That's policy. This bill is framework legislation. It's enabling legislation. It requires this conversation to happen. between every climate action plan, which is produced every 5 years. There's discussions that happened on an annual basis all the way between those 5 years, between the executive and the climate commissioner, all the way up to 2045 when we reach net zero. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing now.
Lovely. Thank you, Laura. That was brilliant overview. So we're going to move on then to Cillian, who is going to do a critique of the bill, and then we'll have time after for discussion. Yeah, so over to you, Cillian. Are you okay, Cillian? Oh yeah, there you are. Good stuff. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm busy talking away to myself there. So yeah, no, this is going to be interesting because really my my reading of it is almost kind of is really the polar opposite of what you've just heard, because I see the bill as being very much, I suppose it comes down to how you define democracy, but I see it as very anti-democratic and having absolutely no accountability and providing for no accountability. This is basically based on my wee spiel here this evening is basically based on a piece I wrote on the political Northern Ireland political blog Slugger O'Toole, where I suggested that this bill is of a piece of the way that politics are done in Northern Ireland, namely that you filter policy and any points of contention out of the public sphere and into processes, into offices, into institutions. You really radically de-democratize and depoliticize all issues. So I say this is it's all a piece of the broad political culture of Northern Ireland. And I just want to talk. I'm only going to try and talk very quickly here, or try and keep the discussion or my bit very short. I just want to put forward 3 points. First of all, really, I would suggest that discussing the content of the bill is moot. And for those of you that don't recognize the lady on the right, it's Mandy Rice Davis. Infamously, when she was asked, when it was put to her during the Profumo scandal, and the QC put it to her in court that Lord or Viscount Astor denied having an affair with her. She infamously said, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? So my point here is that, yeah, Mandy Rice Davis applies because proponents of the bill would say that it's a good thing. So really discussion about it doesn't really get very far. The bill, seemingly there seems to be the numbers in the assembly that might pass it. So really what's going to be done about it? What I would suggest, however, is that questioning the authors of the bill isn't moot. And then I want to move on to talk about potential responses. So I'm not going to spend very long on this because it's already been outlined. What does the bill do? Aims to cut carbon emissions to net zero by 2045. Again, the 2050ism, 2045 seems to be a bit of a moot point, but maybe we can chat about that later. The bill provides for the executive to produce climate action plans to build incrementally to that target. The bill is sponsored, if the targets aren't met, the proposed legislation would require again the executive to amend the CIPs subject to assembly approval. The bill is sponsored by all the parties apart from the DUP and the TUV. And that's really the reason why it's moot. Amendments to the bill really go forward in the committee stage. And of course, proponents will say that we should respond to the bill and mobilize, but we may as well be saying that all cats are black at night. The committee made up 3 DUP, 2 Sinn Féin, 1 UUP, 1 SDLP, 1 Green Party, and 1 Alliance. So really what I'm suggesting is that, well, if the targets aren't met, still goes back to the executive, still goes back to the assembly. So it's a closed shop at the consultation stage. If the bill gets passed, it'll still be a closed shop. Which brings us to the meaning of the bill. My point about don't question the bill, question the authors. The bill, as I've mentioned, is of a piece of the dominant way of doing politics in Northern Ireland. So you filter contention and deliberation into pre-established channels, so you can tinker around the edges of a problem without really making any substantive changes. So by filtering climate emergency into a pre-established climate office, what the bill really does is to depoliticize climate change and climate activism. It moves that space of deliberation and discussion out of the public sphere and into these channels. So what the authors of the bill are effectively doing is handing over legislative competence for the amending of the CIPs, for instance, and oversight to the executive. The commissioner is to be independent, but I mean, if we think about some of the commissioners that we've had in Northern Ireland, victims commissioners and so on and so forth, the record hasn't been exactly stellar. So what you kind of think, do you learn from history? No, you just kind of keep repeating it, and you create another office of commissioner. So in effect, what the proposals mean is that climate change and climate activism will become routinized and will be based on the cyclical CIPs, where there's basically no potential to feed into the process, no oversight or accountability, and it falls again back to the assembly. So again, it comes back to this how you define democracy. If you see the assembly as being democratic, being transparent, being accountable, all of these things, well, you might think it's a good thing. But if you see the assembly as, well, the government is returned every 5 years, we have 5 parties of government, and there's absolutely no chance of getting any of those voted out. If you take that point of view, then you might suspect that the bill actually isn't all that democratic. Taken one step further, a cynical reading might conclude that out of sight, out of mind will be through this cyclical policy. Out of sight, out of mind will be combined with sinecures for bourgeois climate activists and academics. So to the conclusion, I was kind of thinking just during the week, I mean, I'm not advocating anything, because I don't think it's, if you can take from what I've been talking about, I don't think it's possible or ethical to kind of put a position forward that, this is what people should be doing. I think it's up to people to make up their own minds. But that doesn't really get us very far. So it's kind of, and then it occurred to me, well, how do you kind of conceptualize this? Well, quite a famous book by Albert Hirschman suggested that whenever change takes place, now he's talking about organizations, but this can be extrapolated to many other things and has been extrapolated to many other things, that whenever change takes place, you've got about 3 options. You can exit, you can remove yourself from the scene, you can withdraw support. You can use your voice, you can resist, you can criticize, you can boycott, complain, mobilize, strategize, organize, or you can maintain loyalty. You can accept received wisdoms or recognize received wisdoms and keep quiet. I think there's another way of conceptualizing this last point about loyalty, and that's the Dirty Hands thesis taken from the Sartre play, where Sartre, where one of the characters talks about, do you suppose it's possible to govern innocently? And what I'm suggesting here is that, yes, you can support the bill, but I suppose intellectually, ethically, morally, you need to realize that you're telling yourself a kind of a noble lie, that you kind of support this, realizing that no, it's not really, it's not democratic, it's not accountable, it's not transparent, and it's handing over power, and it mightn't even achieve anything, depending on the makeup of the assembly whenever these CAPs go back. So with that, yeah, I suppose to return to Sartre, I suppose support for the bill then would take the form of bad faith. And that's me.
Okay, thank you, Cillian, for a provocative presentation. And it is interesting, how do we get a nuanced kind of take on this and not split and polarize? I'm kind of very interested in how a movement does that, but I'm really looking forward to also the discussion we're going to have after this. So, but first then we're going to listen to John Barry, Professor John Barry, and his take on the bill and climate action, and maybe any hints towards Extinction Rebellion's part. We're kind of open to all views on this.
That's great. Thanks, Rosie, and thank you for the invitation and for being here tonight. In much the same way that Cillian disagreed with Laura, I'm going to disagree with Cillian and Laura in some degree, and it's good to have these healthy debates. I mean, the reality is the bill, just as Laura quite rightly pointed out, and this is something I want to return to where XR could help, that this absolutely ludicrous framing that the BBC and others have taken up at the whim of Edwin Poots and the DUP, that somehow it'll either have us eating worms and larvae, according to Sammy Wilson, or that it's going to decimate the Northern Ireland agri-food sector, absolutely has to be challenged. And there's one thing XR can do, even if it is critical of the bill, is to get on the media, stop the BBC from, buying into that lazy narrative. As Laura said, this applies to every sector: transportation, housing, land use. And in particular, if you have any farmer friends that can, say they're not afraid of this bill, this is something that should be welcomed in terms of securing the livelihoods of our farming communities. That's something that I think absolutely we need to scotch. So just in the same way as this bill does not decimate the farming sector, it does not decimate or domesticate radical climate action. So I would disagree with Cillian if somehow, and I don't think that's actually what you're saying, because it's not as if somehow that people in XR, or indeed anybody with an ounce of a sense of modern bourgeois politics, that simply passing a piece of legislation is at most the start of something. It isn't going to solve. The climate crisis will not be solved by this bill, folks. And the framers of the bill know that, and we all know that in terms of how modest the bill is. And I'll come back to how I would much rather have a stronger bill that was and challenge net zero, by the way, but also the date. We should have really been 0 by 2030 if we're being really serious about this. So the bill is not ambitious enough. It is as much as probably could be mustered given the various coalitions. The Climate Coalition NI, I'd like to give credit for. So I think it's important to see that just as this bill does not threaten farmers, it does not threaten radical action at all. And I'm just curious as to why Cillian said that. We may come that into the discussion. There's a danger, of course, even in what I've just said there, which partly puts me on the side of Cillian, where radicals are always going to be critical of anything that smacks of bourgeois politics and legislation. That's the nature of our position. And we could be accused of saying, well, we're trying to allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. How much transparency would a bill or a process that Cillian is outlining? Is it that forget about the assembly, should be a citizens assembly that should be having oversight on this and so on? I think that's a genuine question to be had. But we have the structures of governance that have been given down to us from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Mother of God, can we not have one name for this place, the bill, the agreement and so on? So for me, while I am supportive of the bill, I'm under no illusion whatsoever that this is going to solve it. And actually, it should be seen as a stick to beat the Assembly with in terms of quicker action. I mean, this week, as many of you probably have seen in the BBC, the chances are, I think the figures, if I remember, there's a 40% chance that in the next couple of years, we will have 1 year where the average temperature is over 1.5, which is the Paris Agreement. So things are getting worse much quicker. I also think that having this bill in place will be a sign of hope that we're making some progress, modest though it is, particularly because I certainly get a sense we are reaching a tipping point. I mean, you've probably seen on social media and elsewhere some fantastic developments globally on climate action, like the court in the Netherlands and a similar court in Australia. And the one in Australia is interesting, where a bunch of young people, teenagers, brought a case, and it's been proven now that the government has a duty of care to protect these young people from the harm from climate damage. There was a similar case in the Netherlands, which kind of backed up the previous Urgenda case. ExxonMobil had 2 of their directors shoved off and 2 climate activists put in. So we're beginning to see lots of changes. And I think the challenge to people who are critical of this bill, whether it's myself and Cillian, is, well, what do we propose we do instead? My view is let's go with the bill and particularly challenge the ridiculous notion that Laura outlined that we could have 2 bills on the floor of the Assembly the next couple of months, when the Bowl Edwin Poots, who'll neither be First Minister or a minister at all, but just simply the leader of the DUP, but actually he's the Minister for Farmers, as everybody knows. The secret's in the name, folks. Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. Agriculture is only what he's interested in, and so on. So I think, just to begin to round up, I think this is a glass half full for me, but it's still only half a glass. Most of us here are very clear, having read the science and obviously been involved with Extinction Rebellion, that we all should know that a bill like this is not going to solve all our problems. It should be used, as I say, as a leverage, as a modest step in the right direction. And if there's anything we can do, it is, as I say, to support, and it's unique in a way that this bill, with the exception of the DUP, and I can't believe it's not the DUP, otherwise known as the TUV, it's got cross-party support, which is unique. And there could be in this that what Northern Ireland has always lacked is a vision, and I'm not saying this is going to provide it, but there's something in this where every party can get behind. Whether you're Catholic, Protestant or the centre, the seas are going to rise. Mama Nature does not give a shit about your sexuality, your gender, your pronoun, your religious background, and so on. This is a science-based analysis. And if you're interested as to why Poots is doing what he's doing, he's taking succor in the Committee on Climate Change, where they've recommended that Northern Ireland would only have a commitment to reduce by 82% by 2050, as opposed to 100% by 2045. On the basis that Northern Ireland produces a disproportionate amount of food within the UK. And it's a real pity in terms of timing that report came out in December, allowing a less stringent and stretching option to be provided to Edwin Poots, and it's kind of a letter of comfort. But the last point I'd make, again, to be critical of the bill, and it's not just of the bill, it's even some of the work I do, is to start challenging the notion of net zero. because they can be seen, for those of you like me who've been raised Catholics, but hopefully like me are now completely collapsed as such. But this is a form of indulgence. It's a carbon indulgence. Net zero does not mean we stop burning all fossil fuels. In fact, it enables and it opens up the Pandora's box for mad shit like geoengineering or carbon capture and sequestration, not the good sort. I think planting loads of trees and re-wetting bogs and nature-based solutions, they're good forms of geoengineering. I'm talking about real science fiction stuff. And I'll give you a very practical example globally of my fear on this. And there's a lot of media coverage about this, and it was all seen as positive. The world's premier energy organization, a group called the International Energy Agency, it released its roadmap for net zero by 2050 globally. You say that's great. That's kind of in keeping with the UK bill, maybe not as stringent as ours in Northern Ireland, which is 2045. But here's the thing. What this report, and it's in the executive summaries, you don't have to read the whole thing. What it says is that it's based on the assumption that what's called the negative emissions technologies that will be required to get to that net zero globally by 2050 have not yet been invented. I mean, this is wishful thinking, where I think you need somebody like Rosie Burrows, who has an interest in Jung and psychology and mysticism, as the why. That's what we're dealing with here. This is mythic thinking. This is absolutely reckless, and this is what all net zero plans have to offer. They allow you to smuggle in less stringent demands. So in other words, by having net zero, and I preside over the Belfast Climate Commission, where our report for the city of Belfast is a net zero report as well. So I'm not saying I have clean hands on this, and I've only really come to this understanding of the dangers of net zero as a concept. But again, just as they think the bill doesn't go far enough, it has net zero and so on in it, bring it on. At the very least, it's created an opportunity in the media with our friends. Hopefully when we get back to, post-COVID restrictions, we can start mobilizing and meeting people more. It's opened up a conversation now. And it's put this issue very much on the agenda. As I say, it's just a real pity, to say the least, the lazy way in which journalists have simply framed it as farmers versus the climate. And it's an unholy alliance between the Ulster Farmers Union and the DUP, which is the biggest coalition we have here in Northern Ireland. It's the reason, folks, in case you didn't know, why we don't have an independent environmental protection agency. It's the reasons why we don't have any national parks in Northern Ireland, is because of the unholy connection between big farmers in North Antrim, because that's really what the UFU represents. They don't represent all farmers and so on. So I mean, I leave it there. So I give this bill 2 cheers with all the caveats that I've said, but it doesn't stop anything that a radical group like XR can keep doing. In fact, we're going to need more of this, not least because I do think there's a greater appetite out there amongst people. I think the pandemic has opened up a lot of opportunities, particularly to see that we've had these declarations of climate and ecological emergencies. That's what we were talking about this before we went live. The Assemblies declared one in February last year. Belfast City Council in October 2019. Britain, the British Parliament, was the first in the world to declare one in May 2019. But what gives? How the feck would any of us know, living in these jurisdictions that have declared these emergencies, how's our lives any different? And that's the opportunity with a bill like this to say, okay, what can we do now and learn from the pandemic in terms of seeing the sectoral level demands that we're going to require? And the reasons why farming, is an obvious place that we have to talk about. It's that we're unique probably in Europe, maybe with the exception of down south, in that our biggest proportion of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from the agricultural sector. In other countries, it's transport, it's industry, and so on. So we have to talk about farming, but there's nothing to be feared in this bill from any sector if they get behind it and so on. And particularly if XR, Fridays for Future, young people striking, I think we need to get the trade unions involved in the larger issue. Never mind Friday strike for the future. What about a general strike? that'll be called by the likes of the TUC or the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. So that's a kind of gone off topic now, but I just think that this issue now opens up that greater terrain of strategy, and the very thing we don't need to do, I would say, is for XR to come out and start hammering this bill, because guess what? It's only going to help Pootsie. It's only going to, delay, and Poots can say, well, actually, XR is against this bill as well. Aha. So for me, and again, I'm not saying that should be XR's position. I'm just saying strategically, I think we got to play a long game here and say, where's the eventual trajectory in this? There's only one step on that pathway. So I'll leave it there, and here ended the secular sermon.
Thank you, John. Brilliant.